This week, the people of Britain got a taste for how the coronavirus epidemic is going to break out in the UK, as apparently a Chinese woman infected with the coronavirus flew from China to the UK before she was put into quarantine in China, boarded a flight to the UK with no regard to the risks of infecting fellow passengers on the plane, no regard to the staff and thousands of passengers at Heathrow Airport, where instead of declaring that she was infected with a killer virus on arrival, went through customs and border control, exited the airport and then proceeded to take an Uber taxi without regard to the driver or his family or the other passengers who would ride in the Uber after her to a nearby Lewisham hospital, walking into A&E department without regard to the staff and patients sat there, effectively declaring that I am ill with coronavirus, so please give me treatment on the NHS. This Chinese person's actions, as those of another pair in York a couple of weeks ago, have once more sent health officials scrambling to track down and test everyone who has been in contact with the infected person, including putting several members of staff at Lewisham Hospital into quarantine. However, there appears to be a delay of about 4 days before the general public are informed of infection incidents, which, just like China, risks losing control of outbreaks. This illustrates why the coronavirus outbreaks in Britain and across the rest of the world are inevitable as a consequence of selfish Chinese people fleeing the communist state, who basically don't give a shit about anyone but themselves, as a consequence of being born into a totalitarian state where people are taught not to think beyond that which the Communist Party allows for, under threat of committing a thought crime that results in a don't give a shit attitude towards fellow citizens. That is the primary reason why the virus raged for a whole month before Chinese state started to take action, because citizens tended to ignore strangers dropping dead on the streets, as they're being brainwashed to keep their heads down. The only thing that matters is themselves and their immediate family. And so, as a quarantine loomed in Wuhan, some 5 million fled the city, taking the virus with them, spreading it out across the whole of China, and not once thinking of what they were doing to their own country. The Chinese Communist regime's propaganda of the past week of having brought the coronavirus outbreak under control by referring to daily falling infection rates from a peak of about 4,500 to 2,000 has now been completely blown away following the declaration of a huge 33% jump in the number of infections, i.e. 15,000 totaling 60,000 Thursday. Also, the number of deaths jumped sharply higher to 1369 from 1115. This begs the question of how many cases and deaths in the preceding weeks are missing from the graph, which illustrates what I've been stating for several weeks, that China's coronavirus statistics just cannot be trusted, where the true number of infections and deaths could easily be triple the official data. So the 15k jump in one day should not be so surprising, given that China is hitting capacity constraints in its ability to diagnose cases of and deaths, as the primary objective is to halt the pandemic rather than to count numbers. So even those suspected of being infected are being isolated by force or told to go home in self-quarantine, far away from the overflowing hospitals and medical centres, thus greatly masking the true number of infections. Though the same would likely be true for most nations, once they start to pass a certain number of infections, that tends to swamp the capacity of healthcare systems. The only difference being that China refused to acknowledge the outbreak for the first month, even going so far as to silence doctors who were warning of a new virus. China is a totalitarian state where the primary objective of every citizen and lowly official is to follow the rules, which means to demonstrate what a good citizen they are by toeing the Communist Party line and to behave in a manner that pleases the Communist Party, which in this respect meant not to be the harbinger of bad news, So clearly, as I've often voiced in my videos and articles of the past 3 weeks, is that officials are reluctant to pass on bad news up the command chain, which is the primary factor in today's jump of 1/3, as suspected infections were tended to be ignored so as to fulfill the Communist Party's objectives for public statements that the virus was coming under control when it was not. So expect to see further such spikes in numbers over the coming days and weeks, as the actual number of infections is likely already well over 150,000, especially as I doubt that the temperature sensors being used are much use in detecting most infections, as a study of cases reveals that the high temperatures only tend to come about a week after infection when the patient is clearly ill. So widespread use of temperature checks is mostly useless in identifying infected persons. Thus travel of infected persons continues to take place, as we have just witnessed with the Chinese traveller to the UK. Coronavirus spread day 68 update. My forecast for the number of infections and deaths by the 14th of February 2020 versus actual reported. Forecast infections 154,000, actual reported 65,000, so 42% difference. Deaths 4,334, actual 1,491, that's 34%. Were this trend to continue into the end of February 2020, then the number of infected would total 421,000, whilst the number of deaths would total 9,630. So the latest data implies a lower spread, but still a relatively high mortality rate of about 2.3%. In reality, the actual number of infections and deaths is likely closer to the forecast than what China's healthcare system hitting capacity constraints implies. As for some weeks, all those even suspected of being infected are not being met by medical staff, but by a barely protected army of police. The fact that China is grossly underreporting the number of cases translates into A. The number of infections outside of China will continue to rapidly increase as contact with infected Chinese people acts as sparks for epidemics elsewhere. B. That the outbreak in China will fail to subside, which is what it should do if Chinese statistics were accurate, i.e. the pandemic would basically come to an end within a couple of weeks or so. But instead, I expect the number of infections to continue at a high rate for several more months. So I still expect the actual pool of infected to pass 1 million towards the end of February, and thus the risks of a global pandemic remain highly probable, and that there are large susceptible populations with poor healthcare infrastructure, such as India, that announced its first infections over a week ago, where outbreaks could quickly overwhelm healthcare systems. Also, that a vaccine is still a good 4 months away, so far too late to have any impact on this pandemic. The bottom line is not to be fooled by coronavirus statistics out of China. The pandemic is not under control, and the number of infected has likely already passed 150,000. With likewise the number of deaths exceeding 2,000 or near twice the official number, the evidence of which is literally being cremated. Therefore, given the actual continuing rate of spread of the virus in China and the forecast and trajectories for the rest of the world, is currently one of being in the calm before the storm stage, with likely several outbreaks that risk overwhelming healthcare systems around the world, as has happened in China. What's more worrying is that when one looks at the world map, apparently there are no cases of the virus in Africa or South and Central America. That is very hard to believe. Instead suggests there are hidden outbreaks underway in those regions that will only make the light of day when the body bags start piling up. Until then, don't be fooled into a false sense of security. The pandemic is coming to your nation. UK coronavirus trend forecast 2020. Taking account the actual trend trajectory of China's outbreak and allowing for the fact that China is underreporting the number of cases by at least 50%, and that the UK is expected to be more open in reporting and handling of coronavirus cases, thus with a better informed public should prove better able to contain coronavirus outbreaks. Even if there currently exists a 4-day lag, that is not good. Thus my forecast conclusion is for the UK to target a trend towards 5,000 infections by the end of March 2020, which will likely result in over 1,000 hospitalizations and unfortunately some 90 deaths, which was putting the NHS under extra strain. However, Britain should be able to cope with the outbreaks up to that point. So I expect the number of infections to only really start taking off early March, when the number infected past 100 and soon start to accelerate into the hundreds. Early March is also when I unfortunately expect the first reported death as a consequence of coronavirus, at which time there will increasingly be economic consequences, especially for the travel, holidays, retail and event sectors, as consumer behaviour will undoubtedly change in attempts to avoid the risk of infections, as we have witnessed in China, where the huge megacities the size of London have turned into ghost towns that would likely be replicated in outbreak hotspots across the UK. So the UK is still in the calm before the storm stage, so people should take measures to protect themselves by both limiting exposure to risk of the viral particles, i.e. by staying clear of those who may have recently been in China, and by boosting one's immune system so as to better cope with an infection, achieved by, for instance, consuming say 2 or 3 oranges a day for vitamin C. Another easy way to boost the immune system is to ensure one gets ample sleep, and I will cover how to protect from the coronavirus in more detail in future articles and videos. And will the coronavirus pandemic trigger a stocks bear market 2020? The bottom line is that we are heading for a coronavirus induced global economic contraction as cross-border travel and trade slows sharply from today to at least into the end of March 2020 and likely into the end of April. So 2 to 3 months of lower economic growth that the stock markets will discount ahead of time. And the rest of this extensive analysis that concludes in a detailed trend forecast for the Dow Stocks Index has already first been made available to patrons who support my work. So for immediate first access to all of my analysis and trend forecasts, then do consider becoming a patron by supporting my work for just $3 a month. And you'll have access to my most recent analysis that includes on the silver price trend forecast, gold price trend forecast, British pound trend forecast for 2020, and AI stocks buying levels for the first quarter of 2020, and my overall stock market outlook for 2020, that's into the end of 2020. And ensure you're subscribed to this YouTube channel for the next video in this series and all future financial and commodity market analysis and trend forecasts.